Okay, so let's do a talk. I want to talk about Anne Widdecombe and the potential martyrdom of Anne Widdecombe. Now, it's fair to be said, and we've got to say it, that it isn't clear and it isn't yet established if we found any guilty party. And it isn't yet established that the person under investigation either did it or is guilty of doing it. But what it seems now well to be established, because the police have put this information out, is that the murder of Anne Widdecombe was targeted. Now, assuming, that's a big assumption until the facts come to light, but assuming that Anne Widdecombe was targeted for her beliefs, that since her beliefs are formed by her Christian faith, that would mean that Anne Widdecombe is a martyr to the Christian faith. And if she is a martyr to the Christian faith, then as Christians we should honor her as such. We should honor her by doing what scriptures teach. Scriptures remember the martyrs as they do in Hebrews 11, and they memorialize them as has happened in scripture, and as the early church practiced the memorialization of the martyrs. Now, in the early centuries of the church, they memorialized them in a Roman way. We should memorialize our martyrs either borrowing from the traditions of the past or by inventing new traditions of memorialization, like the evangelicals did when they memorialized the martyrdom of Charlie Kirk in that stadium. They stumbled into martyrdom veneration without even thinking about it, showing that it is the natural impulse of the church to celebrate the martyrdom and the martyrs. And if someone has been martyred for their faith, as it looks like Anne Widdecombe has, then as Christians what we should not do is allow her to have been killed for her politics. This is a Christian martyr, and we should make sure that the world knows that she is a Christian martyr. And her home and the place where she was martyred should be turned into a church, and it should be something that pilgrims go and visit, because Anne Widdecombe will have represented the most public martyrdom that I'm certainly aware of since Charles I, though there probably was other martyrdoms since then, and probably quite a lot. The reality is that if she was targeted for her Christian faith, that the man that carried out that martyrdom and that attack on Anne Widdecombe shouldn't just be charged for murder, well, whoever they capture, whoever they investigate in the end, they should also be charged for a hate crime, because they've been motivated by a hate crime, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, it's just deliberate trolling. Now, ladies and gentlemen, so as Christians, we should defend her honor by making sure that she is remembered for the martyr that she is. And that includes making sure that the man that martyred her, ladies and gentlemen, is prosecuted with the additional offense of being motivated by religious malice, a hate crime. Now, we can't say whether the person that they've arrested is guilty or not, but let us assume, and again it's a big assumption, that the person that is finally prosecuted for this martyrdom is following the pattern of left-wing violence in this country. That means, ladies and gentlemen, that we have got to recognize in this country the problem of left-wing political violence that is getting a soft pass by the state, ladies and gentlemen. Hope Not Hate, for instance, has recently deleted their page that villainized Anne Widdecombe. They villainized her, and they stirred up resentment against her, and now it would appear, and it is possible, that she might have been killed by a left-wing terrorist. We see left-wing terrorist organizations like Antifascista running rampant across our country, attacking people. We see left-wing terrorist organizations like the pro-Palestine terrorist organization getting a soft pass in our courts, ladies and gentlemen. There is a problem with left-wing violence, and yet the establishment continues to be obsessed about the potential threat of the right, even though right-wing terrorists are few and far between, and right-wing terrorist actions are few and far between. But the establishment bangs on about attacks and the threat of the right, even though statistically you can actually count that there is more left-wing terrorism happening in our country than right-wing terrorism, and there is more Islamic terrorism happening in our country than left-wing terrorism. So what's going on? What's going on is that after World War II, it was encoded into the British establishment to guard against Nazism, to guard against fascism. And that is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But the state needs to reorientate itself to the threats of today, not the threats of 70 odd years ago. And the threats of today are coming from Islamic community and left-wing community. Islamic terrorism and Islamic radicalism, and left-wing terrorism and left-wing radicalism. And in the same way that the state guards against Nazism and fascism, and that's a good thing, it also needs to guard against Islamism, the Muslim Brotherhood, and left-wing terrorism infiltrating, penetrating, and acting in the state. And that's why it's a problem that Andy Burnham has brought into the heart of government the former head of Hate Not Hope. Hate Not Hope, that hate group that spun up hatred against Anne Widdecombe, who has now been murdered, it appears, in a targeted offence, was being villainized by Hate Not Hope. The group that accuses Tommy Robinson of stirring up hatred against Muslims is itself stirring up hatred against people on the right and against Christians, brothers and sisters, because Anne Widdecombe has been a devout Christian for decades and her beliefs were rooted in her Christian faith. Therefore, we need to be asking questions of Andy Burnham's politics. That's why I encourage SPUC and the Council of Bishops in England to sue Amnesty International for stirring up hatred against Christian groups in this country by releasing a report that said that SPUC, which is a Christian pro-life group, and the bishops of the Roman Catholic Church were, in Amnesty's words, anti-rights, ladies and gentlemen, and called for the state to set aside funds to monitor these organizations. These Christophobic organizations like Hate Not Hope and Amnesty International are Christophobic organizations that should be condemned for their bigotry against the Christian church and against the Christian people, ladies and gentlemen. And the state needs to smash down left-wing violence and prescribe as terrorist groups like Antifascista in the land, and groups like the pro-Palestine mob. The pro-Palestine mob that basically fractured the back of a police officer by striking her with a sledgehammer by attacking a British Air Force base and damaging British jets and breaking into arms companies that supply arms to the British Armed Forces and to Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, we have witnessed in our culture people being allowed to support Hamas abroad. If you support terrorism abroad, it is very easy for you to fall into the idea of supporting terrorism here in the UK. When we tolerate terrorist supporters abroad, we cultivate the supporting of terrorism here in the United Kingdom. And that is exactly what we have seen in this country, ladies and gentlemen. Now, let me move on, because there is another problem. I want to point out the way that the media treat the martyrdom of Anne Widdecombe. The media firstly keeps describing Anne Widdecombe as a former Tory. Ladies and gentlemen, Anne Widdecombe is a full card paid up member of the Reform Party and one of its spokesmen. The fact that the media do not want to frame Anne Widdecombe as a member of the Reform Party is because it feeds into the debate around why Nigel Farage accepted a donation of £5 million for his own security. It draws attention to the fact, now recognised by the Home Secretary, Shabina Mahmood, that Reform politicians are the target of left-wing terrorists and their lives are truly in danger. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, the media have tried to whitewash the fact that Anne Widdecombe is a member of the Reform Party and a spokesman for the Reform Party, ladies and gentlemen. The media and left-wing politicians also accused Nigel Farage of politicising her death by going when they went to lay flowers at her home. Let's just be clear, these Reform politicians had just lost a colleague and in some cases a friend. The most natural thing to do is to go and lay flowers at the place where your friend dies. It's something that we all do, ladies and gentlemen. When somebody dies in a car accident, you lay flowers where they die in the car accident. But that did not stop the politicians in Labour and Green from trying to spin that act as if the Reform Party were politicising the death of their friend and colleague, and by doing so they politicised it themselves shamelessly and unequivocally, ladies and gentlemen. We have to recognise that those on the left do not play by the rules that they demand that the rest of us play by, ladies and gentlemen. In other words, they are the most reprobate, most viperous, most disgusting hypocrites that you can imagine. They want you not to fight them in the way that they fight you, ladies and gentlemen. And I say to all of you that we should tear up the left-wing rule book of political engagement, and we should engage the left on the terms and in the ways and with the tactics that the left engage the right, ladies and gentlemen. Just as they tried to use the law against their opponents, so we should try to use the law against them. Just as they used dirty-handed, underhanded tactics against their opponents, we should use the same narrative arguments against them, because they will not learn until they are opposed with equal force, ladies and gentlemen. Let us be clear. We should honour Anne Widdecombe as a martyr. We should honour her memory as a martyr. And we should celebrate her Christian witness as a martyr, ladies and gentlemen.